also talk about current calls in other countries as well, but I'll take questions here as well. If anybody has any questions about the system and what has happened in the second call area or whatever.
Hey, Bob, this is Charlie. With all the changes, people moving south, does that mean there's a more opportunity in the 2 zone to get, some old call signs?
I would say yes, because when you're in a particular call area, you usually want to get a call sign that matches where you live. And I'm sure there are a lot of 2 calls that are available that have gone by the wayside. If you want a 1x3 call sign in the second call area, there's a pretty good chance you'll be able to get it. That's how I would look at it.
Be interested to see the statistics for, let's say, the last couple of years, how the ham population has changed. All those different zones. I mean, because you're showing 67 to 2021, but it'd be interesting to see intermediately how they have gone up, and changed dramatically.
Well, given the situations in New York and New Jersey, I know a lot of people are fleeing both states because of taxes. So I also know that New Jersey has been losing population. That's a big factor.
W2JC?
Yes, Jim.
You didn't mention it, but at one point they changed the fact that the licenses were based on the station location, and they are no longer based on that. They're based on the operator's call sign, which means that the number doesn't mean anything anymore.
That's correct. Nowadays, you can keep your call sign. They changed that, I think, in 1977, around there, where if you change location, you don't have to get a different call sign. That's why when I lived out in Virginia, West Virginia, and Indiana in the 80s, I kept my call sign. And I had no intentions of changing it, whether I stayed there permanently or not. So that's another factor than call signs these days. You don't have to change your call sign if you change your location.
It used to be that you could have 3, 4, 5 call signs if you had different addresses.
That's true. They used to have, you'd be able to have secondary call signs, but in the late 70s, they abolished that. Because originally I wanted to apply for N2SU as a secondary, but it was right around the time they got rid of that. So I had to change my call sign. So I'm glad it worked out as it did for me, but back then you could hold over more than one call sign.
Bob, W2TTT. That was 1976 when they got rid of the secondary call signs. I seem to recall we had both an operator license and a station license. What was the basis for the FCC getting rid of the station license? Do we know?
I think it was just more a matter of convenience more than anything else. Rather than have 2 separate documents, if you will, they just combined it into one.
I think part of the concern was at the time that by getting rid of the station license, your station had no specific federal protection, for lack of a better term. You gave a privilege to an operator, but not to the station, and therefore their legal standing with things like local would be jeopardized. And I often wonder whether or not, had that stood, whether or not we would have had a better process through, some of the PRB1s type of nonsense.
I really don't know. That's debatable. But I remember the days when I first was licensed. If you wanted to operate portable for, I think, a stretch of more than 10 days or something, I forget what it was exactly, you had to inform the local FCC office that you were operating portable from such and such a location. So, that they used to have a rule like that on the books. I do remember that early on. They got rid of that, I think, around 1972 or so.
Yep. And what about repeater call signs? Oh, go ahead.
I heard something about repeater call signs. Yeah, they were given out in the 1970s, I think, at one time, the WR2 prefixes, but they weren't given out very long. FCC finally abolished. They were allowed to take on a club call, if you will, or the person who owns the repeater. I remember the WR2 calls very well.
Bob, you hear me? Hi, it's Fred, AAB.
Yes, you're one of the victims of geography.
I'm one of the victims of geography. That's correct. And I have a lot of questions and comments. The question I want to ask you, first of all, do you know where the idea of call letters came from originally?
No, I don't.
Landline telegraph stations. Every one of them had a 1, 2, or 3 letter combination, which was their call sign.
Okay.
In fact, the Susquehanna station that used to be on Midland Avenue had a call sign. It was PJ, which stood for Passaic Junction. That's what the station was called before it burned down around 1961. Just one example. Okay. Now, when did the first novice call signs issued in two-lane? What were they? What were
They were WN2s, I think.
WN2I calls. The first novice calls issued to A's was 1952. KN2 calls in 52. These calls were reissued again in the late 50s in 57.
Right.
That's how guys like Jim and Van got the W2 calls. There is a WN2 calls. My original call was WN2CST.
Right.
I was not the original holder of that in 62. It was issued to a guy in Upper New York State in 1957. So I had a reissued novice call, which is really kind of weird, but
So did I.
That's right. That's right. Okay, now, which call area had the most number of hams prior to World War II?
I think it was probably the second. Well, maybe not the second because it wasn't the. I would probably say 8.
9. In fact, the ninth call area was the first call area in the continental United States where they issued K calls. K9AA, 1947, by the way, was the year. And I know that because I have in my archives QSLs from K9AA something or other in 1947. That's when they first issued them. The first Ks were issued in the 2-lane and 6-lane in 52. That's right.
As I said, it took about 4 or 5 years to go through the.
Well, look, even in my day, it took like 5 years to go through. In 62, they were still issuing WV2 and WA2 calls. Just a few months later, I got my WN2, which became a WB2 call. What about the WT calls? You remember them? WT.
Yeah, there were some temporary calls that were issued in the 1970s.
Right.
It had to do with the issuing of licenses and the timing and all. There were a few of them issued, not very many. Very
few. Just like the WD calls, which they only got like halfway into the A in the alphabet, and then they stopped issuing them. Let's see, the A call, by the way, A prefix was used not for amateur use, but on Mars circuits. Army and Air Force Mars used A, A2 and AF2 for Air Force.
Right. I remember in Army Mars in the early 70s when I was licensed out here, Alpha 2 Uniform Sierra Alpha at Fort Monmouth.
Right. And the N calls, of course, were used by Navy. Originally, by the way, the first Navy Mars calls were N0, no matter where you were.
One of them too. I was November 0 Bravo Whiskey Bravo.
Right. Then they issued N and N0. Right. I had one of those calls too back in the day. By the way, where were the first K1 calls issued? Do you know?
Where
and when?
I think that was in Greenland right after World War II.
That was KG1 after World War II. The first K1s were in the U.S. Philippines. Don't forget, U.S. military was occupying the Philippines since the American War. So K1 was Philippines, and then it became KA1. Then, of course, those calls were dropped, advanced class calls, and then extra calls, later on. So the islands had KB calls. KB4 was Canton back in the 30s, right? The other K4s, X's, and K7s. K4 was Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands in the 1920s, 30s. K6 was Hawaii. So some of the islands, too, they later changed that. K7 was Alaska. Now, of course, this is before they were state possessions. There was no K5, or I think there was a K8 also somewhere out in the Pacific. I don't remember where. Okay, next question. What was the exact date the W prefix was mandatory in the United States by CONUS? Do you know the exact date?
No, I don't.
October 1st, 1928. That if I had to call, 2AAB, prior to that, I suddenly became W2AAB on October 1st, 1928. By the way, that call was the first issue of that call. I researched it. First shown in the government call book in the July 1915 edition. That's how old that call dates back to. And I actually have a QSL from the 1920s from 2AAB, a guy who lived down, I think, in Monmouth County somewhere. I forget what town. So that's an old call. In fact, when the first Hamfest I went to, and I had that little, call sign sticker on my shirt, I said, "You must be 105 years old." I met this guy. It's funny, but it's a great old call. Thanks for the presentation. Very good. You can make some additional comments and ask some additional questions, but you covered it very well. You really covered it very well. It's a complex history. And in the second call area, we've had so many calls and so many reissues. The W-2 calls are reissued like 5 or 6 times over history. Starting in the early 1930s, they were already reissuing calls.
Question on that. Okay, question on that, Bob, because you mentioned it in this is WX2R. About calls in other countries. I can remember about 3-4 years back being at the RSGB conference outside of London and talking with a ham, a UK ham, who asked me, "Do you know how many call signs have been issued in the UK?" And his answer was that nobody knew. Okay, because the fact is that when you were licensed, your license was permanent and it was never given to anyone else. So from the first G3, okay, let's make it up, right away to the 2 EOs, which is, I think, current, that type of thing, is that you have a call sign and you can have more than one call sign, but you never lose your call sign. And I was just wondering, personally, I think that's kind of a nice idea to have something that's permanent, that's always yours. Your point.
It's no longer true, Ed. It's no longer true.
The UK has a really convoluted call sign system. The way it works now is, I think when you start out with the foundation license, which is the basic, when you get an M3 call, when you get an intermediate, you get the 2E0 or 2 whatever letter you are. And I think the full license is M0 or M1.
Yeah. The other question, which one of us, I think, probably knows, is has the license for a U.S. amateur always been 10 years?
No, it used to be 5.
5. Okay. Yeah. And that
Excuse me, no, it wasn't even 5. In the 1930s, they had a Class C license, which was, I think, 2 years or 3 years.
That's
only.
really interesting because that really gets back to one of your earlier slides where you look at, it was a 1967 ham population by call sign as opposed to today's. And obviously, if you look, the U.S. population in 67 was about 200 million. Today, it's about 350 million. So if you look at hams per capita, okay, obviously that shows the decline of hams in the overall population. But the other piece is that if you look comparatively against other countries, and France being one that sort of comes to mind, is that your license is renewed every year in France. That if you looked at a comparison over 10 years of the U.S. ham population as opposed to the French population, you see the U.S. ham population going up because an SK in year 1 of your license carries through until it comes for renewal 10 years from now. But that's not necessarily in the case in France. And so you see just the inverse, where you see a declining ham population. And obviously per capita, obviously it's more dramatic. Yeah, I'd just be curious other comments that you may have had either from European countries or some other countries in terms of licensing.
Yeah. Well, in a lot of European countries, some of them don't have call areas like France, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Norway. They don't have call areas. Most of them do, but those are some that don't. As an example. Then you have the UK, which is very different too.
Yeah.
Hey, Bob, I have a question for you. I don't know if you can answer the question. I got my novice in 1963 from a W2GC. He was a real old timer then. I guess I don't know. I was just curious to see how far back he got that license, but he was at 1x2.
Okay, well, if you know his name, I'm sure you do. You could go back in old call books and find out how long he was licensed. He probably was quite an old timer even then, going back to the 20s with a 2-letter call.
Good. I'd like to look it up. Because he was Al San was his name. He was in East Orange. He gave me my novice back in 1963.
Okay. No more.
Remembering back when I was 78, that's basically the beginning when all this call sign restructuring happened, the group Ds, group Cs and Bs, etc. My call sign, by the way, was WP4AFJ. at that time. And something that I know the old timers would know, and you touched briefly on, Virgin Islands used to be Kilo Victor 4. And now you hear a lot of Kilo Victor 4s from the mainland, because at around a little bit earlier, before I got my call sign, that's when they did the restructuring, EV4 became KP2 and WP2 and NP2. There were still a lot of stations in Virgin Islands that never changed their call signs, and they kept their Kilo Victor 4. And I believe there's still a few out there. I knew several of them have passed away, Kilo Victor 4 Bravo Alpha and Kilo Victor 4 Foxtrot Zulu. Many know that last call sign, Herb Schoenbaum. It was interesting how, a lot of these changes happened. And a quick note, and with this I sign off. I remember following the other part of the name of your presentation, our fourth name. And I remember when I was living in Connecticut, in the Hartford area, I decided to change my NP4H call sign. And I went to an AA1NV call sign. And let me tell you, what you wrote there, it happened to me. All those that knew me from the time that I got that call sign, NP4H in 81, they really hit me hard. And they told me, how are you? It's like changing your name. We all know you with that. So unfortunately, and I say it that way, I changed back to my original call sign, but now it appears as a vanity. That's why to this day, I've decided to, even though I'm living in the 2 area, to keep my NP4H call sign, and I'll probably keep it, then I'll become a silent key with it. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Norma.
Are there any other questions for Bob?
W2JC, comment?
Go ahead, Jim.
You have opened it to current calls in other countries, and nobody's brought that up. But it seems like only in the last few years, some really weird call signs have been starting to show up from a lot of different countries, like Mexico and Chile. And I'm wondering if that's because they ran out of their regular ones, or did they open another class of license, or what? How come we're getting all?
Going to that, I think Mexico's allocated 4A through 4C, and I think 6D is another Mexico prefix. So they do have other allocations which they're now using for amateur radio. I guess there are a lot of prefix chasers and all that. They put these special call signs on the air. But in South America, like in Chile, I think what they do is they have other prefixes besides the CA through CE block, XR, XQ. I've worked Chilean stations with XQ prefixes. So I think a lot of it depends on the license class with some of those call signs. And of course, you have special events as well.
Other questions or comments? Tom?
Okay, going back to Fred's mention of the telegraph. Paladin, okay, have gun, will travel. On his professional business card, off to the side, it had wire Paladin, P-A-L.
San Francisco. It added, it said wire Paladin, San Francisco. That was an address, Tom.
So how did they get routed, though? So I'm in New York, and I need his gun. How do I communicate?
That was the name, Tom. That was the name of the addressee. If you're addressing it to a person by name, it will be to Joe Smith, so-and-so street, Chicago, Illinois.
Right.
But his address was simply Paladin, San Francisco. That was his address. And that's how it would be. That's how it would be sent and routed to San Francisco. Yeah.
Routed. How was it routed? I mean, was it
on a trunk line? On a trunk line. Or the telegraph system, just like the telephone system became a trunk line. The telegraph systems were the same way.
Oh, okay.
From one city to another, till it finally got to the destination.
Oh, okay. His particular call sign.
Well, they would be calling the next station in the trunk headed in that direction, okay? And then that station would pass it to the next one and the next one until it got to California, then it got to San Francisco, and then it went to the addressee.
Okay, so kind of like our current messaging system.
Well, kind of like the traffic system set up by the ARRL, where you have the second region, first region, so on. You have this, and then you have area nets, Eastern area net, Central area net, Pacific area net, and they went from one to the other. It just went across country that way.
If I can interject here, I think we're going to have a speaker in an upcoming session that's going to actually talk a little bit about that. So that might be a good question to hold.
I was very active in the national traffic system in the 60s, 70s especially. and I had assignments on the second region net, New Jersey nets. I was also net manager for the CW net, and also Eastern Area net. I even had a TCC sched, which is Transcontinental Core, where you go cross country by schedule with a specific station. I used to schedule a guy out in Nineland. It's called W9DND. So they had several of these routes through which you could send from one part of the country to another. It was quite a complex system, really, but it worked, and it worked quite well, still works. Same concept, all comes from the old landline telegraph system. That's what it's based on.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, W2KBF.
Carl?
Carl?
Yeah, comment about this 1927 reorganization of the FCC, or when the W came in. If I recall, that's right about the time frame when FCC outlawed Spark and everybody had to go to CW. And that could be why there was suddenly more international communications.
But I think Spark was outlawed somewhere around that time. Yeah, that's very possible.
Yeah, that sounds about right, Carl.
Yeah, because Spark was very inefficient.
However, Spark, here's a little tidbit. Spark was still being used on ships. Every ship until at least like 1950 still had a Spark transmitter in reserve in case the CW transmitter failed. My uncle told me that because he worked on ships for years. He was a ship operator as well as a coast operator. Surprising that they still had Spark there, but only in an emergency could you use it.
Any other questions or comments? Who wants the last word other than me?
I just want to say thanks to Bob and thanks to you, Ed, and thanks to Tom for getting us all set up. It was a great presentation. Thank you.
This was indeed a great presentation, a great way to kick off 2022 Coffee Talks at our 7th year of doing this. So thank you. Thank you so much for just a great show and some great questions from a great audience today.